One of the most resonant, commanding, and celebrated voices of the 20th century once spent 5 formative years in absolute self-imposed silence. Imagine possessing a voice that would eventually read poetry at a presidential inauguration, author global bestsellers, and move millions to tears, yet believing with every fiber of your being that speaking a single word could cause catastrophic harm to those around you. How does a mind trap itself so completely in a prison of its own making? And more importantly, what extraordinary psychological mechanisms are required to tear down those invisible walls and forge a voice of indomitable power? The journey from profound mutism to unparalleled self-expression reveals a breathtaking map of human resilience, illustrating exactly how the deepest traumas can be alchemized into unique psychological strength. At just 7 years old, Marguerite Johnson, the girl who would eventually become known to the world as Maya Angelou, experienced a childhood trauma so devastating it fractured her reality. After enduring severe abuse, she confided in her family, identifying her perpetrator. Shortly after this revelation, the abuser was murdered. For a young, developing mind, the cognitive processing of these events resulted in a terrifying, egocentric conclusion. Her childish logic drew a direct, undeniable correlation. Her voice had killed a man. She believed that her words possessed a lethal, uncontrollable power, and that the only way to protect the world from her existence was to swallow her voice entirely. This paralyzing guilt birthed a severe psychological defense mechanism. She retreated into selective mutism, a complex anxiety disorder where an individual is completely unable to speak in certain social situations, despite having the physical ability and language skills to do so. This was not a stubborn refusal to communicate, nor was it a simple phase of shyness. It was a desperate subconscious strategy for profound emotional regulation. In her mind, silence was the ultimate act of self-control and harm reduction. If her vocal cords were lethal weapons, the only moral choice was to lock them away forever. The weight of this self-imposed psychological exile was compounded by the crushing realities of the segregated American South. Growing up in Stamps, Arkansas, she was already navigating the systemic, daily traumas of virulent racism and entrenched sexism. To be young, black, female, and silent in that specific era was to be profoundly invisible. She was pushed to the absolute margins of a society that was already meticulously designed to ignore her existence, dismiss her intelligence, and strip away her agency. The external world demanded her subjugation, while her internal world demanded her silence. Yet, within this profound isolation, an extraordinary cognitive shift began to take root. Without the ability to project her thoughts outward, her brilliant mind turned entirely inward, transforming her environment into a vast, silent laboratory of observation. Because she was not expending cognitive energy on formulating speech or engaging in the social dance of conversation, she became a meticulous, hyper-focused student of human behavior. She studied the cadence of footsteps on the porch, the fleeting micro-expressions of the adults around her, and the unspoken silent language of survival that marginalized people use to communicate. This hypervigilance, initially born of pure fear and trauma, slowly morphed into an unparalleled emotional intelligence. Her memory, unburdened by the distraction of speaking, became a steel trap. She was silently absorbing the rhythms of the world, categorizing the nuances of human pain, joy, hypocrisy, and resilience. She was unwittingly building a vast internal reservoir of empathy and sensory detail. The silence, which had begun as a dark prison, was slowly being repurposed by her psyche as a protective incubator for her intellect. The echoes of those early limitations still held her captive, but the foundation for her future resilience was quietly being laid. She was gathering the raw materials of human experience, even if she did not yet possess the psychological tools to share them. The intervention required to unlock this vault would not come from force, but from a strategic, empathetic reframing of her deepest fears. The turning point in this psychological journey arrived in the form of a compassionate intervention by Mrs. Bertha Flowers, an educated, elegant black woman in her community who recognized the brilliant, trapped mind behind the young girl's mute exterior. Mrs. Flowers did not demand speech or shame the child for her silence. Instead, she offered a bridge built entirely of literature, recognizing that a direct confrontation with the trauma would only reinforce the psychological walls. Mrs. Flowers introduced a profound cognitive reframing technique, a psychological strategy that involves identifying and then changing the way situations, experiences, or emotions are viewed. She told the young girl that words mean more than what is set down on paper, and that it takes the human voice to infuse them with the shades of deeper meaning. This was a brilliant, strategic dismantling of the child's core fear. She was subtly teaching her that the voice is not inherently a weapon of destruction, but rather a vital instrument of art, beauty, and human connection. By reframing the voice as a vessel for poetry rather than a trigger for violence, Mrs. Flowers shifted the entire psychological narrative. This delicate intervention sparked the beginnings of self-efficacy, which is the foundational belief in one's own capacity to execute the behaviors necessary to produce specific performance attainments. For the first time in 5 years, the young girl was given a reason to believe that her voice could create something beautiful rather than something catastrophic. The return to speech was not a sudden cinematic breakthrough where the floodgates magically opened. It was a grueling, terrifying practice of psychological exposure therapy. She started by taking books of poetry into hidden spaces, reading aloud in the absolute safety of her own company. She had to physically feel the vibration of her vocal cords again, testing the waters of expression without the immediate threat of consequence. She was rewiring her brain, slowly proving to her own nervous system that speaking did not result in death or disaster. Step by agonizing step, she reclaimed her agency. The transition from silence to self-expression required immense grit, defined as a passionate perseverance for long-term goals despite significant psychological friction and repeated setbacks. She had to consciously and repeatedly unlearn the trauma-induced belief that her existence was dangerous. Every spoken word was a tiny, monumental victory over the paralyzing grip of her past. Decades later, the fruits of this agonizing internal labor would permanently reshape the global literary landscape. The meticulous observation skills honed during her years of mutism provided the vivid, sensory details that would define her autobiographical masterpiece, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The deep empathy she cultivated while silently watching the struggles of her community allowed her to write with a universal resonance that transcended race, gender, and geography. The publication of this book was a revolutionary act of post-traumatic growth. This psychological phenomenon occurs when individuals experience significant positive psychological change as a direct result of struggling with highly challenging, life-altering circumstances. Maya Angelou did not merely bounce back to her baseline state after her trauma. She used the shattered pieces of her childhood to construct a profoundly elevated sense of purpose, transforming her deepest wound into a global beacon of healing and solidarity. The shadow of that early systemic bias and personal terror still lingered in the memories she wrote about, but the pain had been entirely repurposed. The very voice she once believed could kill had become a life-giving force. It breathed dignity, validation, and immense courage into millions of readers who felt similarly silenced by their own traumas, abuses, or societal marginalization. She became the voice for those who were still trapped in the quiet dark. Consider the profound irony and the systemic challenges of her trajectory. The world had presented her with every conceivable reason to remain voiceless. The devastating intersection of severe childhood abuse and the suffocating, violent environment of Jim Crow laws created a perfect storm designed for permanent psychological defeat. The phenomenon of stereotype threat, where individuals feel they are at risk of confirming negative stereotypes about their social group, could have easily kept her marginalized. Many would have understandably remained trapped behind that wall of silence, surviving but never truly living. But Maya Angelou's journey reveals the extraordinary, defiant elasticity of the human psyche. She demonstrated that trauma, while devastating and deeply unfair, does not have to be the final author of one's identity. Through deliberate emotional regulation, the guidance of a mentor, and the slow, courageous rebuilding of self-worth, she forged an entirely new narrative. She proved that the mind can heal itself by finding new, constructive frameworks for old, paralyzing fears. Her poetry and prose resonate with such profound authenticity precisely because they were forged in the crushing crucible of absolute silence. When she spoke of the caged bird singing, she was not writing a distant, clever metaphor. She was documenting the exact physiological and psychological mechanisms she used to pry open the bars of her own mental cage. She knew the texture of the silence, and therefore she knew exactly how to make the song shatter it. This is the ultimate testament to human psychological resilience. It is the profound understanding that our darkest, most silent periods are not necessarily permanent voids. When navigated with courage, the right support, and a willingness to cognitively reframe our pain, these periods of intense struggle can become the very incubators where our most powerful, authentic selves are constructed. The silence is not always an end. Sometimes it is the deep breath taken before a masterpiece. The psychological journey of Maya Angelou's silence reminds us that our voices, once lost to trauma, fear, or societal suppression, can indeed be found again. And when they are finally unleashed, having been tempered by pain and refined by observation, they possess a depth, a resonance, and a staggering power that can shake the very foundations of the world.